Good afternoon. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for our first Lunch and Learn in April and Social Emotional Learning. I'm Chris Steinmetz from the Autism Society of Iowa. And I want to thank everyone. Our speakers today are Leslie Rogers and Kirsten Smith. Leslie has a variety of experience in speech therapy, occupational therapy, and working with children with autism. She graduated from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in 2000 with a Bachelor of Science in Education, and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in 2002 with a Master of Science in Speech Language Pathology. After graduating, she worked for Omaha Public Schools for 5 years as a speech language pathologist. Leslie currently works at ChildServe, a nonprofit specialty healthcare organization focusing on pediatric rehabilitation. Leslie is the autism clinical manager for the ChildServe Autism Program, which focuses on serving children with autism up to 21 years old. In 2019, she became a board member of the Autism Society of Iowa. Kirsten has a variety of experience in providing speech therapy and co-treating with occupational therapy. She graduated from the University of Northern Iowa with her Bachelor's of Arts in Communication Disorders in 1997, and from Indiana University with her Master of Arts in Speech Language Pathology in 1999. After graduating, she worked for the public schools in Indiana and California from 1999 to 2003 as a speech language pathologist. Kirsten is the clinical manager for speech and occupational therapies at ChildServe. In her current role, Kirsten enjoys developing specialty services and educating staff members at all levels. Recently, she has become a co-leader of ChildServe's Trauma-Informed Care Team, which is focusing on helping the organization develop trauma-informed care pediatrics. So I want to thank Leslie and Kirsten today, and I will let them start their presentation. Thank you.
Great. And Chris, I don't know if you wanted to mention, we will take questions, and if you want to put them in the chat, we will try to answer them as we go, or we will also be available for some questions at the very end as well, if you'd like to ask those. So I'll try to monitor the chat, and Kirsten can as well as we're doing the presentation.
Right. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and kick us off on our topic of social emotional learning. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of brain anatomy and function. And I just want to provide a disclaimer here that what I'm going to share is a very abbreviated version of what actually happens in our bodies, in our brains, just based on some time constraints, and not knowing the interest level and the knowledge level already on this topic of the audience. I tried to keep it a little bit more general so that everybody could take something from it. So hopefully you will find some information useful on figuring out like what our brains and bodies do when we are interacting with the world. So we'll kick it right off, jump right in. So when we think about how we interact with our environment, our first point of contact with our environment is our sensory receptors. So these are those receptors that are in our skin, our ears, our eyes, things like that, that can detect changes in our environment and determine whether they need to send this information on up to our brain to be acted on. And for us, this information isn't going to really get passed along unless the stimulation is strong enough or long enough to trigger a response in us. And this is different for everybody. Some of us might have a very low toleration for touch. Some of us need a little bit deeper touch to stimulate a response. And so once we do have a reception of something sensory, it'll start going up into our nervous system. And part of our nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system. This is a division of our autonomic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system's job is to respond to threats in our environment. And so when we do receive notice of a threat, our body can kick into protection mode and go into keeping us safe. And this is what we have heard of as the fight or flight response. There could be a freeze. There's also some other F's like flock and flood as well, but most of the time we hear about fight, flight, or freeze. And this is really due to an automatic chemical release in our body that we don't have a lot of control over. It happens automatically to keep us safe. And then there's another division of our autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is more responsible for our function of rest and breathing and digestion. But it's really got to communicate with other areas of the brain to assess the situation and then help us regulate ourselves to know whether it needs to kick on or whether it needs to let the sympathetic nervous system take over. And so if we have some dysfunction in our parasympathetic nervous system, we might see issues with digestion, sleep, appetite, muscle tone, lots of different things like that if we are having issues with our parasympathetic nervous system. And there are a couple of key neurotransmitter chemicals that our body secretes. There's more than these two, but these are a couple of key ones. And something that is interesting to note about these neurotransmitters is they don't really originate in the brain. They originate in the gut. Something that was news to me when I started doing some research into this, talking about the brain in our gut. And that's where a lot of these chemicals are released and where they originate. So dopamine is really released when the body receives a feeling it desires. So if something happens to us that is pleasurable, we'll get this dopamine squirt. And what that does is it motivates you to want to do it again. So when we find something that is pleasing to us, our dopamine kicks in. We have this chemical response that we think, oh, that was fun. Let's do that again. It's the chemical of reward. On the other hand, we have serotonin. It's a mood regulator, and this helps to keep our happiness levels at a constant, kind of keeps us calm, cool, and collected. It helps also to promote morning wakefulness. And then some issues with bowel movements and blood clotting. It's got some more biochemical reactions as well. So when we receive something sensory, it goes into our nervous system. Our nervous system decides that, yes, it needs to react to this. Our neurons start firing. So when we have an experience or we can concentrate on something, our neurons become activated and they start to fire with those electrical signals. And so when those electrical signals actually happen, we create new proteins that let us wire new connections. This is, what we refer to as neuroplasticity, because we're really creating associations between events in our brain. And so this is where that statement, neurons that fire together, wire together, comes, because when we have events that are happening close together, they become connected in our mind. And so this is what really goes into helping us create our memories. When we have things that are associated, those chemicals wire those events together and then puts that into our memory. And there's a couple of different types of memory. The one that is most important for today, I think, is our implicit memory. And these are things that happen and go into our memory that allow us to do something without even thinking about it. Implicit memories actually begin forming before we are born. And for the first 18 months of our life, most of our memories are going to be implicit. If you think back about your life, there's probably nothing before 18 months that you can really, really say, I truly remember that happening to me. It's there in your memory, it's there in your body, but you can't necessarily call it to mind and replay that memory. So what this does is it starts to encode our perceptions, our emotions, sensations, and behaviors that become automatic in us because they're stored in places that we don't know that they're there necessarily, but they're stored in our memory and they're stored in our bodies. And this causes us to form expectations about the world based on what has happened to us in the past, which can create then a priming, which readies us to respond in a certain way. So if we've had things that happened to us in the past, and those neurons fired and created an association and wired with other neurons, when those things happen to us in the future, we might respond in a certain way and not really know why we're responding that way. And it could be something that's happened in the past, which has primed us to respond that way. Explicit memory is what we more typically think about. Our memories are consciously thinking about facts, experiences that we actually remember, concepts we've learned in school, things like that. It can be divided into episodic memory, which is more your personal experiences, or your semantic memory, which is the facts that you've learned. And there's an area in the brain called the hippocampus. And this is important because it helps us to integrate our implicit and explicit memory. It helps us to kind of make sense of some of the memories that we are holding, and helps us to start to understand why we act the way we do and what has helped create our brains to interact with the world the way we are. So then once we kind of get up into the brain, things come into our downstairs brain. And that is made up of the brainstem and the limbic system. It's more of our primitive brain, and it's responsible for our basic functions like breathing and blinking, things that we just do and don't have to think about doing. Also, our innate reactions, our fight, flight, or freeze again, and some very strong emotions like anger or fear. And then close to that downstairs brain, there's a little part called the amygdala. And it's a very small part of our brain, about the size and shape of a walnut. And this is also something that helps keep us safe, because it can very, very quickly process things happening in our environment and decide whether we need to do something to keep us safe. It's constantly alert for danger. It's constantly scanning the environment to see if there's anything in the environment that is dangerous. And it allows us to act before we think. Because if you think about it, if there's something dangerous, we don't really want to have to process through and think about what we should do, because by the time we do, we might already be harmed. So our amygdala keeps us safe in that way. It allows us to act before we have to really process everything that's happening. The problem with that is the upstairs brain, which we'll talk about next, it can be hijacked by the amygdala. You can think of the amygdala kind of like a baby gate that, when you have babies in your house and you don't want them to go up and down the stairs, you put the baby gate up so that they can't go up. So the amygdala can do that in our brains, that if it's too constantly primed for danger or too active, it can throw up a wall and not allow our thoughts to go up into the upstairs brain and just keep us in the downstairs brain where we are reacting as if things are dangerous. So our upstairs brain is made up more of the cerebral cortex and its parts. It's really responsible for us being able to think about things, imagine things, plan, set goals, make good decisions, control our emotions, control our body, be empathetic with people, make morality decisions, and understand ourselves. The upstairs brain is where we want everything to get to, but sometimes it doesn't get there. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is like right behind your forehead here, it's the very front part of your brain. This is where ultimately we want things to go. It allows for proper assessment of our stimuli, and it reviews information and generates a response, which is what we ultimately want. We want to be able to respond to things happening and not just react. And then also in our brain, we have our brain hemispheres. You probably are pretty familiar with your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere, and have learned about that in the past, might have some inclination as to whether you feel you are more in the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. But your left hemisphere is very logical. If you think about left, there's lots of L words that can go with this: logic, literal, linguistic, linear. If you're somebody who lives in the left hemisphere, you love your list, you like to check things off your list, and it cares more about the letter of the law. Whereas your right hemisphere is more holistic. This is where we process more of our nonverbal information, like facial expressions, eye contact, posture, and gestures. Cares more about the big picture and making sense of that. It also helps you to understand your gut feelings on the right-hand side. And then there's an area of the brain that bridges the gap, just like as the hippocampus bridges the gap between our implicit and explicit memory. The corpus callosum helps to bridge the gap and integrate both sides of the brain to allow them to work together, so that we're not just relying on one side of the brain, because it's really important as much as we can to be able to access both sides of the brain. And then taken as a whole, the brain is really a very social organ. It allows us to take in clues from our social environment and influence our inner world, which then in turn we can influence our outer world. A key factor in our well-being is being able to focus on others rather than the self. And so our brain, when things are functioning well, allows us to do that. And having secure attachments to caregivers, including teachers, can cause the not having the secure attachments can cause the social emotional circuitry to shut down with that. That's not to say that, children with autism or anything don't have attachments to the families. I don't want you to hear me saying that, but I'm just saying that that is a key component in our circuitry. So then how do we kind of develop these skills? How does our brain develop? It doesn't just, we're not just born with this fully functioning brain. So if you think about really young kids, they're very right hemisphere dominant. They haven't mastered logic. They don't have the words to express themselves yet. They really live in the moment, do what they please. They want things right now because they can't really plan things out. Responsibilities and time really don't exist for them. It's a very free way to live when you're very little and living kind of there in the right hemisphere. Asking why. So when your kids start to ask why, that's a signal that your left hemisphere is starting to kick in, because then you're really trying to understand things and look at the logic behind things. If we are stuck in the right hemisphere and we're really living in the right hemisphere, we might feel what's called an emotional flood. It's more common in the young children because they haven't developed those left hemisphere skills yet. And it might be seen as an illogical freak out sometimes, where we don't really know why something is upsetting to somebody. And for us, it might seem like there is nothing that they should be upset about, but it's because they're really experiencing a lot of emotions on that right side that they don't yet have the words to tell us about. And so where it might seem very illogical to us is logical to them. They just can't tell us how. And so they're experiencing all these emotions. But if we are living on the left side of the brain and not really allowing our right side to kick in as well, this might be seen more as an emotional desert. Sometimes this is more common in older children where they're trying to kind of play it cool and act like things don't really bother them and there's no problems, no issues. So we might see that they're denying their emotions, or they're saying that things are no big deal. So we really don't want to be on either side. We want to be able to integrate the two and access both sides of our brain. So how does our downstairs brain develop? Well, it's actually pretty well developed from birth. If you think about it, when we talked about the downstairs brain being part of that system that controls our fight or flight and our survival, that makes sense, because even as babies, there are things that our bodies do to help us survive. And so our limbic system really develops more quickly than our prefrontal cortex. It's pretty well developed through the teen years. The prefrontal cortex, the teens are starting to develop those skills a little bit more, but they're still kind of living more in the instant gratification world. And so they're looking more for stimulus that can be very quick, like social media, their sports and gossip and things like that, because those can provide some quick and easy stimulation. Our upstairs brain isn't fully mature until our mid-20s. Some people will say that that is getting a little bit older, and so it's our late 20s that we might not be fully developed in the upstairs brain. It's really under massive development during your first years of life. There's a lot happening in that area, and then it starts to get refined in the teen years, and then it's fully mature in the 20s. So if we stop to think about the fact that our upstairs brain isn't really developed until our 20s, we can see that sometimes the things that we are asking kids to do, behaviors we're wanting them to demonstrate, are really dependent on part of the brain that's not fully developed yet. And so we have to take a step back and think about what we're asking our kids to do on a regular basis. Now, that does not give kids a get out of jail free card. We still want them to be able to learn these skills, but we also have to kind of think about what we're asking them to do and whether they have the capability to do that on a consistent basis. And then we throw the amygdala in there. Especially in kids, we talked about the amygdala blocking the connection between the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain. So even if a kid is seemingly having good skills in that upstairs brain, there are times when they're not going to be able to access that. And even as adults, that's true for us as well. There might be times when we're extra tired. We've had a long day at work. We've gotten some bad news. We're not functioning at our best. And then something else happens on top of that, and instantly our amygdala takes over. And we freak out. We flip our lid is what the Whole Brain Child book calls that. This is the amygdala. It's taking over, especially in kids, it's going to take over a lot. And so that's where we can get a little bit frustrated with our kids sometimes, because it's like, yesterday you had these skills and today it seems like they're not there. It could be that, there's something else going on in their life and the amygdala is just taking over a little bit more because they haven't learned how to control that amygdala a little bit better. So looking back at memory retrieval, our memory retrieval activates a neural cluster similar to, but not identical with the one created at the time of encoding. So what that means is our memories are always distorted, even if we think we are right. So, if you play some of those memory games where you see a scene and then the scene gets taken away from you and then you have to answer questions about it, that memory has been encoded, but it's not exactly 100% what actually happened. And so that's something for us to keep in mind, that things that have happened to us in the past or things that we think we remember happening to us might not be actually what happened. And so sometimes our memories are priming us for things that aren't actually true. And that can impact how we respond to things when they happen again. So if you put this all together, our connection to the outside world is our sensory receptors. They're stimulated when they detect a change. And if that change is strong enough and long enough, it will stimulate our nervous system and send that sensation up to, on the pathway up to the brain. The sensory message is sent to the brain through our sensory receptors. That message causes a reaction in what's called the reticular activating system. We didn't talk about that today, but that's another gatekeeper that determines whether that should go along further up into the brain. Some other areas of the brain as well. And then our reactions occur in our respiratory, cardiac, digestive, and musculoskeletal systems. And then finally, when it gets up to the brain, it decides what to do and it produces a response. So just broken down a little bit. First, you have a feeling, then you have an emotion, then we can either react or respond. And what we really want is for us to be able to respond and not just react to things. We want to be able to tame our amygdalas to allow that information to get up into our cortex so we can respond rather than having a reaction. So a few things can go wrong, and each one of these can be like a topic in and of itself. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. So Leslie can have a chance to talk more about that now that you know about the brain, how we learn our social emotional skills. Sensory reception. We all have our own sensory priming, and if we don't get enough of what we need, we might lack appropriate engagement or interaction. But if we get too much, I'm sure you all know, we can attempt to block out that sense to avoid overstimulation. There is something called neuroception, and this is the process that everybody goes through to decide whether we're safe or not. And it's different for everybody, and it's dependent on our perceptions and not whether there is really a danger. Again, this goes back to our implicit memory. Things that have happened to us in the past prime us for this neuroception. Sometimes this neuroception might be faulty, and we're detecting things as dangerous when they're really not, but to us, they feel like they are. Interoception is another perception, basically, and this is the perception of the inside of your body, including your heart rate, your breathing, and then combining that with an awareness of the emotions that go with it. So being able to really link how we feel inside and the emotions that we're feeling when those things are feeling that way inside us really helps us to regulate ourselves and access complex thinking and kind of our sense of self. So if we have difficulties with interoception, we might not feel our physical or psychological cues. And so then we might not be able to suppress sensory information. And then if we're not able to do that, sometimes that can impact our self-esteem and sense of well-being, because we just don't really know what's happening inside us, and why we're acting the way we are sometimes, because we aren't able to pick up on those cues of what's happening, and why. And then also, if we are living in fight or flight, we can be living in fight or flight for several different reasons. There could be a trauma background, including things like sensory trauma, where our sensory receptors are picking things up and making things difficult for us. Because when we are in fight or flight, our muscles tend to tense up so we can run if we have to. Our pupils dilate so we can see better in the dark if that's what is dangerous. Our ears become hypersensitive so we can hear dangers that might come. We sweat or breathe quickly. We might seek stimulation to activate our pleasure centers to get rid of some of those fight or flight, or we might seek safety by avoiding interpersonal interactions. We might be anxious if we're living in fight or flight because we're anticipating things that could present undesired stimuli, and we're always on alert for that to happen. Or we might become angry or aggressive when you try to take away a desired stimuli because it's making me feel better. And so if there's something that's making me feel better and we try to take it away, then we become angry about that. And this really can impact our function in our emotional brain, because then it is allowing things to bypass the cortex and not allowing us to respond, and then we simply react. So that's, in a very, very brief nutshell, our function and anatomy of our brain and how it can impact us and whether we can respond well to things in our environment. And Leslie's then going to take that and build on that and say that, when things are going well and things like that, how we actually learn our social emotional skills and what they are. So go ahead, Leslie.
Okay, great. I learned something new, I think, every time I listen to Kirsten give that talk on the brain. I think it's so important when we're working with kids, our own kids, or kids we work with professionally. I just think it gives us another perspective to look at as far as what might be going on. I always think we're like the private investigator, so we're always trying to figure out, I wonder why that's going on, or wonder why that's happening. And so I think that I've even had many social groups really benefit from some brain anatomy, just to kind of understand their own brain and kind of help them, monitor and think through why they might react or feel a certain way. So I do think a lot of that is very important to social emotional learning. And like Kirsten said, the social organ is, our brain's very social. So this next part is really just a snapshot of some of the learning we did. I'm not sure Kirsten mentioned, we actually teach a 2-day course through Drake. We haven't, because of COVID, we got our first one in before everything. And then we really enjoy teaching on site here at ChildServe because of some of the tools that we have here to show. And so we really were just picking some things out of this that might be a great highlight to the 2-day course that we give for teacher recertification. And this is from, the viewpoint of Kirsten and I, who are clinicians in an outpatient setting. So we tried to incorporate some things that maybe teachers might be interested in. And so in our research, we really came across this model that there are education departments across the United States that implement competencies related to social emotional learning. And Iowa is actually one of them that is working on with this model. And we got the privilege to meet with some of them to talk through what they've been doing as a department to kind of promote some of these competencies. So this is a picture of the CASEL model. CASEL stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And this is just from their website. It's a trusted source for knowledge about high quality evidence-based social emotional learning. This model is meant to support educators, policy leaders, and just enhance experiences for all pre-K through 12 students. And their mission is to help make this an integral part of education from preschool through high school. So I think they're really feeling it's critical for students. And I think we heard this from the teachers that were in our first course, just how important social emotional learning is for children in the school systems today. So they really felt strongly that we needed to incorporate these things into lesson plans, into our daily lives, to try to teach these skills for students to become successful. So you can see here is a great picture of the model that they have. It's a circle, which includes all the different places that many of our children are operating. So in the home and community, they're maybe outside, way outside circle, schools, classrooms, and then just at the core of that are these different core competency areas. So a part of in the classroom is they're looking at what curriculum and instruction are children getting. So how does the social emotional learning fit into history? How does it fit into science? There's some really creative things out there, ways you can put into lesson plans, different ideas to promote social emotional learning. How is social emotional learning integrated into the schools with their practices, their policies, what they're focusing on, and then just out in the community, what do our family and community partnerships look like? So we'll go through each of these areas and just talk briefly about them. So self-awareness, this is something that we work a lot with children on here at ChildServe, and I'm sure other places, schools work on. Just the very, ability to identify basic things like emotions, emotions in ourselves, emotions in other people. What's our self-perception? So what do we perceive about ourselves, as Kirsten talked about a little bit with the brain development, as well as others, and how that might impact them. So what are our strengths? What plays into our ability to be confident about ourselves? Do we have great positive talk that promotes that self-confidence? And then just self-efficacy as well. Self-management. So this kind of goes with regulation, being able to control our impulses, develop some stress management skills and discipline. We work a lot with kids on these, I think, executive function type skills where, they have to be good at setting goals and how they motivate themselves toward those goals and just really what their organization is. I always say that executive function skills are like the CEO of the brain. You get your brain to do what you need it to do in order to do these things. And then building off of just self-awareness, social awareness. So, one of the beginning points of just being able to have a conversation is being able to take a perspective of another person. So, before you can do that, you have to develop the skill of knowing what common interests another person might have with you, what they might be thinking. I think a lot of times kids struggle with being able to figure out what another person might be thinking or feeling. I feel like we probably perspective take all day long, always thinking about how other people are viewing ourselves. Developing empathy, just appreciating the diversity around us, of being able to recognize that and communicate that as well. And then just general respect for others, knowing that that's big in people's perception of you. If you respect others, they perceive you as, a kind person or somebody they'd like to work with or be friends with. So I think that that's a really important awareness skill of just how you treat other people. So in general, relationship skills, we all know that we have different levels of friendships. So we have acquaintances, we have close friends, we have very best friends, we may have a significant other. And so a lot of these things build into our relationship skills. So can we communicate with each other? Can we do teamwork? I know my daughter just got done. It was a great project. They had to create a biome with a group of 2 other students. She's in 5th grade, and it was incredibly challenging. And I think that's good. She really had to figure out how to work with those around her, how to deal with maybe some conflict, how to get your ideas in there, how, deal with some rejection of ideas. So I think that those are important skills that her teacher was building into their science project that I really appreciate. And I know a lot of teachers do that as well. And then just, social engagement. So how engaged are you with the people around you through play or conversation or other ways. And then responsible decision making. We all want our children to grow up and make responsible decisions. So that's really an important skill that can start in early education. and something we work on here in therapy as well, is just identifying what's the problem. I think a lot of times it's hard to sometimes even identify what a problem is. I've seen worksheets come home where they have to identify the cause and the effect. I think that's great. Being able to realize that something that might happen might have an impact later on. Being able to think through and analyze situations. Something that I use a lot here in therapy to work with children is this mechanism called SOAR. So it's part of that, each of the letters stands for a different thing they have to think through. The first one is specify the problem. So that goes along with this. O is for observe what's going on around you at the time of that problem. A is for you're analyzing what's going on, what could be the problem that's going on and why, and then just how you respond to the problem and then reflect. So I really have found it beneficial for increased social emotional learning and just social learning in general to be able to work through independently a mechanism to improve their ability to observe things around them and make a good decision. And then just, the rest of this I've kind of talked through with that is reflecting into just what's our ethical responsibility in the world. How do I play into that? What things can I do to be better? So I think those are all things that make people good students, but they also make them great employees and citizens and just good contributors to our world. So phases of social emotional development. I find this really interesting. I think for me, when I was going through this, reading more about it, it really helped me with some goal setting. It helped me kind of also think through when a child comes in or a child I'm around, what phase might they be in as far as developing socially. I think we can think through our own children in this. And Kirsten, remind me, this is a fluid kind of mechanism, right? So it's not like you start at phase 1 and go through phase 9. You could be at different stages of development at different times. So, but generally speaking, I think a lot of people and children progress through these phases, but depending on their situation may look different at times. So there's a really great checklist that we came across. It's from the ICDL, and I tried to look up exactly what that acronym was, but if you just would search for functional emotional development capacities chart, it kind of is a really quick chart that might help you with figuring out or evaluating where the person you're thinking of is as far as just phases. So I'll give some examples for each phase from this checklist, as well as some others from a different site. So we'll go ahead and move into phase 1, which is just regulation and attention. So I think this is one of the very first things I always observe and look for is what kind of attention and alertness and regulation does the child have? So are they able to regulate once they're dysregulated? So we, a lot of times we'll see kids that may have a 5-minute type dysregulation or a couple minutes, even shorter, then they're able to kind of get it back together if you give them a little bit of time. But, really in this phase, they want to recover from distress within 20 minutes. And then they can focus and attend back on what they were doing. So really focusing on the calmness and just showing interest in you as well as toys and other objects in their environment. I think a lot of our OTs work on that phase a lot. We see occupational therapists, physical therapists working as well as speech therapy, but specifically, I know the OTs work a lot on regulation. The second phase is engagement and relating. So this is their ability to engage in relationships, including depth and range of just different emotions. Also can be incorporated into what type of engagement they have. Do they become withdrawn or become aimless when under stress? So some different examples of this with the checklist is that they're responding to your overture, so smiling, frowning. They show pleasure towards you. They might anticipate an object that is taken away. So where did it go? They show smiling if they're interested. And they might protest and kind of grow angry when they're frustrated. But they can overall recover in this area after from distress after about 15 minutes. So phase 3 is moving into more circles of communication, which if you've not heard that term before, it's not necessarily related to just words. It could be gestures or facial expressions as well. So it's when the child interacts and I interact back, you've closed a circle of communication. And if you can continue to go back and forth, you'll close more circles of communication. So in this phase, they can enter into some two-way purposeful communication and close a circle of communication. They're able to kind of initiate with another person to keep activities going. So this could be reaching up for your hair, or reaching their arms up to be picked up. Could be hugging back when hugged, smiling when you're pointing to something, or while taking a toy from your mouth and putting it down. Protesting, so pushing food off the table, screaming when they don't get the toy they want. Or it could be some fear by turning away, being scared, crying when a stranger approaches. I think a lot of us start to notice that in our infants when they get the stranger danger feel and they start to cry if being handed off to somebody else. So that is kind of phase 3. Phase 4, we're moving into more shared problem solving, some more two-way purposeful problem solving. And it's a little more complex at this point. They're putting many circles of communication together and kind of starting that initial problem solving. So this phase is necessary for negotiating some of the most important emotional needs, like being close to others, being assertive, limiting our aggression, kind of navigating safety type situations. It also could be something like when they're looking at you and saying or not saying, I did it, look what I can do. And they can kind of do that with their eyes or words or gestures. Some examples of this from the checklist are lots of examples of this. I'll just say a few. Closes 10 or more circles using words, facial expressions, touching or holding, rough housing, or some more large motor games like chasing, climbing. They can use their looks and vocalizations to invite other people to share their excitement, like jokes with other children or adults by laughing together about something. And this is kind of where they start to insert some curiosity. So explore things independently, be able to communicate across space to make you feel close to them. They may tell you no and run and hide. And then also might start to see some behaviors like hitting, pinching, screaming. May see the temper tantrum. We call it the, I don't know, upstairs or downstairs temper tantrum. We went over that in our class, but you might start to see some of that as well. Level 5 or phase 5 is starting to do some things related to using symbols. So you might have an idea. Pretend play is a very good example of this. Or they might use words and phrases to convey something that's an emotion. So look at this, I'm angry, or start to share some other ideas that they might have. So some checklist ideas for this is they might start to do pretend play with 2 or more ideas. So pick up the truck and then crash it into some rocks, give the doll a hug and have a tea party. They might use words, pictures to convey 2 or more ideas. So no sleep, I want to play, or play. They also start to communicate their wishes and intentions by using a variety of modes. They might use simple motor games, so that has some rules to it. So taking turns throwing something. And then just start to make funny words, laugh, start to show some curiosity as far as what objects might do. So pretending an airplane zooms around the room, going to the moon, lots of fun things in this stage that we start to see kids do. Phase 6 is building more bridges between emotional thinking. So you might see them answering more WH questions, noticing other people's feelings. They might have some opinions that start to come out. They start to make connections between what internally they might sense with their emotions. So I'm mad because you're mean. So this is kind of the start of some higher level thinking, probably in grade school, where they're trying to problem solve. They might do some inferencing or guessing about why a situation might happen. And they start to kind of monitor their mood and different impulses, and you might see some more regulation there. So phase 7 is more triangular thinking. Child's able to explore reasons, maybe multiple reasons why a feeling might occur. They might be able to compare reasons why a feeling might occur, such as, I feel left out when Susie likes Janet better than me. We've probably heard that. I've heard that at my house, maybe early elementary age. Because they can do some observations that they see Tom as Sarah's friend, so John becomes Tom's friend, and they start to kind of expand that thinking and work the crowd, maybe even for some manipulation. Some different ideas here is that the checklist actually kind of ends on level 6, so they don't have much beyond that. The rest of these 7, 8, 9 phases are more grade school and beyond. So we might see just a growing after this. Phase 8, how am I doing for time? Okay. So once again, this is grade school, typically developing grade school. They might start to feel some differences in feelings. So they might be able to distinguish different grades of feelings about anger. So maybe I'm irate versus I'm just a little upset. That takes a little bit more insight, I think, to be able to do that. They start to see where they fit on the social ladder. So they might start to see where there's different groups of friends or different groups of people that go together. Maybe they might start to feel where they might feel the most accepted. So we kind of call that source of friends. So where might our common interests lie that we might want to find a source of friends to join, and where would I fit in with that group? And they might also start to see that there are some consequences to their behavior. So they might be able to think through or reflect. I know I've seen behavior reflection sheets, or just different ways to reflect on what consequences might happen. And just in general, I think they start to see the shades of gray, so they can become the better problem solver. It might not be so black and white, but they can think through maybe a rule that isn't always the same in one place. So they might be able to see and think through how that rule can change depending on the situation you're in. And then we have phase 9, which is really intermittent reflective thinking. They have a stable sense of self. They start to internalize, what are my values? They start to reflect on what feelings they have. Maybe I shouldn't feel this jealous about something, or maybe it's not like me to be this angry about something. They also start to value their sense of self, and realize that they might not be accepted with a peer group, but I can handle that. I have the skills necessary to deal with that. Maybe an example would be, Sally was mean to me because she's having a bad day, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. So it shows that they're able to think kind of beyond themselves with that. All right, well, we did end about 10 minutes early, which is great. That'll leave some time if anybody has any questions. Like I said, there's many more books, topics, slides that we could go over. If we had more time, we tried to pick the things we thought would give a general overview and be helpful as far as the topic of social emotional learning. We did a lot of reading. The Whole Brain Child, I think, was mentioned. I read The Explosive Child by Ross Greene. That was something that wasn't in this presentation, but I found very helpful when dealing with very big emotions and maybe some challenging behavior. Kirsten, I'm not sure. The Autistic Child is a really great recommendation. If there's other books you can think of that you read during this that you enjoyed or learned. We have a whole stack. We actually had to divide and conquer with reading because there was so much out there. Sorry, I put her on the spot with this.
We also just moved offices, and so I'm not sure where everything is right now.
They're up there. I'm just not sure
where. There was a good one that some of those stages came out of, and it was talking more about social emotional skills in early intervention, but it was a really good one, I think, for our therapists to read and probably parents to read as well. Let's see real quick if I can find it.
Okay, well, we'd be open for any questions that you might have or any comments or other observations that you've had with your experiences. We love to hear from people. So we heard lots from the teachers. We had about a group of 20 some, and they were full of great wisdom and great examples. We just had a really great course with them.
It's this book here.
Oh yeah. What's it
Social and
called?
Emotional Development in Early Intervention. It's by Mona Delahook.
Leslie and Kirsten, maybe afterwards, I can collect the titles of the books from you,
Sure.
and then we can just email those out to everybody
Sure.
who's registered so that they will have them. for
Absolutely.
this. Leslie, Leslie or Kirsten, do you want to talk a little bit too about when you did this with the autism self-advocates, the adults, and some of their responses and how they found themselves? Because they really realize that a lot of times they want to have friends, but the friends are more invested in the friendship than they really know how to be. And so we did a session with them as well.
Mhm. Go ahead, Kirsten.
They were really interested in the phases and trying to identify where they were. And to them, their feedback was they didn't feel that they necessarily moved through the phases in a chronological order. And so we talked a little bit about the fact that, sometimes we do jump back and forth from phase to phase based on whatever is going on in our environment at that time, our fatigue levels, our stress levels. Sometimes we might be in phase 9 most of the time, but we might bump back to phase 7 when we're really tired. We also did own up to the fact that as therapists, we don't always get it right in terms of where kids are functioning the majority of the time and where we need to go next. And so sometimes we can teach skills that are maybe at too high of a developmental level. And so we end up giving kids some splinter skills where they have some higher level skills that they do really well, but then there's still a lot of those phase 1, phase 2 skills that need work. And we miss that sometimes. And so that might have contributed to their sense of, I'm not quite sure where I am or how I developed through. We spent a lot of time talking about that as well as some other things about just accessing, the healthcare system and things as well with that. So Leslie, I don't know if you had anything to add.
No, I don't think so. I think though, Chris, that the next presentation, I believe in this series is going to kind of talk through some of those access difficulties that they've experienced, maybe some ideas and hints on that, I believe. Or am I not remembering that correctly?
Yes. The next lunch and learn is going to be working with your physician, which is, yes, is directly a result of a request by the self-advocates. And how do you get your physician to understand what you're saying? How do you know, how do you put in order what you need to visit with them about and get organized? So that will be our next lunch and learn next Thursday at noon as well. If anyone would like to sign up for that. Thank you for reminding us, Leslie.
Sure. Well, it was a great segue. Kirsten was talking about it. I thought I would just segue right into that. So great. If there's any other questions, we'll give just a second. And if not, we'll get Chris those book titles. And I think you all have our handout. We sent that ahead of time for these slides. So feel free to reach out to Chris with questions, or Kirsten and I, if you have our contact information, Chris can include that as well. We'd be happy to answer any questions or talk more about this topic.
So if you think of a question afterwards, you can always email me too, and I can get it and get the answer to you as well.
Thanks, Jonna. I appreciate that. We always take a guess as to what people might be interested in. So it's helpful to know maybe something on here was helpful.
I just have a quick, I just wanted to let everybody know that Mona Delahook will be coming to Iowa virtually
nice.
next fall through the Iowa City Autism Community. So we'll be getting that sign up out in May or early June. So
That's great, Sue. Are you going to send that through so we'll get that notification like the newsletter or as an email from?
Right.
Great,
Yes.
awesome.
Yep.
That'd be great for our therapist since I can't remember if we ended up buying this book for everybody, Kirsten, or you bought it for everybody in the trauma.
Yeah, we had a
Yeah.
group of 10 therapists or so,
Yeah.
took the trauma-informed care class, and so they bought that.
Okay.
We bought that for them.
Leslie, you do have a question here. Do you see
Oh, I
it?
do.
Would you like me
Nope.
to read it?
Well, let me pull it up. Oh, sure, Myra. If the brain doesn't fully develop until mid to late 20s, why isn't there more being done to help young adults that are in need of help that will work with their ASD thinking? It's a very great question. Go ahead, Kirsten.
I'm processing
Yeah.
the answer. Let me just see the question. Why isn't there more being done to help young adults that are in need of help that will work with their ASD thinking? Good question. I think part of it is just really getting everybody on the same page of understanding how the brain does develop. Like I said, this is probably a fault in just like the therapy educational system, is that we don't all understand it. And that's full admittance. And so it's something that continues to need to be developed in our training. That's why we're doing some of these trainings for more people, so that we can really start to look at, okay, how does the brain develop? What is expected of us at this time? What phases are there? What phase is the child that I'm working with in, so that we can understand where they need to start and what we can do. Something that we're working on that is child serve as well, just trying to help people understand more of that. So that's a very good question. It's a gap, I think, and something that we're trying to work on being able to shorten that gap.
Yeah, and I think you run into, like all of us know, the cliff of services where kids or people age out about the same time that this development might be happening, or they're graduating from high school about the same time this might be happening. And so it's really tough to figure out who needs this information in order to, make that transition. So if anybody has any great ideas, that would be wonderful. For parents to be included in therapy. Yeah. Myra just said that there needs to be an allowance for parents to be included in therapy since they're adults. The professionals only listen to them and get to the surface issues. So yeah, it gets to be tricky when people reach adulthood to try to continue to figure out support for that individual. So.
Yeah, they're legally adults, but we're not, our brains aren't even, quote unquote neurotypical. Adults aren't fully developed yet either. And so you're right, it needs to be more of a inclusive setting.
Yeah.
I'm going to put in another plug for our groups that are happening in our high school group and our adult support advocate group, that are Zoom groups online. And I think that when these people get together, they're problem solving some of their own from each other. Either, for one thing, they're finding out they're not the only ones whose thinking is maybe a little different and they need help with. So they're problem solving. And Chris and I have seen some really good progress since we started these last spring. So to sign up for those groups, that's on the ASI website. And if you have any questions, you can get a hold of Chris or you can get a hold of me. So
the groups are high school and then self-advocates, the adults,
the adults.
support groups that Sue is talking about. So yeah, you can just email me and I can get that information to you as well. Email address, I'll put it in the chat room.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and for Chris and Erin at the Autism Society for setting this up. I'm looking forward to the next few weeks. I hope to be able to join most of those, so continue on our learning.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next Thursday for our next lunch and learn about when you're an autistic patient and working with your physician. Thanks, everybody, and have a good afternoon. Thank you, Leslie and Kirsten.
You're welcome. We'll stay on, Chris.
Okay, wonderful.